Now that my slab portrait has come out of the kiln, it is a lot harder, and you'll notice the color has changed. This is now called bisqueware. So at this point, now that it's harder, I'm able to start to glaze it. So I'm going to use some glazes to paint it in natural colors. So I'm going to start with a tan color. It's probably the closest one to my skin color. And I'm using a smaller brush. The reason why I'm using a smaller brush is that I really want to be careful that I'm only coating the surfaces that I would like to have this color. I don't want to mix colors because then the color will bleed into other areas. Now, when you feel like you've covered the whole surface, like for me, it's the skin here, what I want you to do before you go to any other step is check to make sure you don't have any peekaboo spots. Peekaboo spots are these little spots that you forgot to paint, because if you forget to paint those areas, they're not going to be shiny and they're really going to stand out. This looks really light now, but once it goes to the kiln, the color is actually going to darken. It's actually going to become a little bit more vibrant. So any spot that I forgot to get, it will really show through. You might even need to turn your self-portrait a little bit so that you can see sort of where you may have missed the spots that you have. You also want to make sure you get the side of your face here. So I'm going to cover up any of those peekaboo spots that I see. Now, one coat is not enough. So what I'm going to do is let this dry, and then when it's dry, I'm going to paint it one more time. But the second time you paint it, it's a little bit harder to see where you have your glaze. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the top and work my way down so I don't accidentally miss a spot along the way. Now I've painted my second layer on my skin here, and I made a little mistake here. You can see that I dripped a little bit of glaze on the hair part. Now, I have really dark hair, so that's actually not that big of a deal. But if I had light hair, then that would be a bigger deal. So what I'm gonna do is just gently take off what I can, and then using a clean paintbrush, I'm going to just use water to sort of wash it away. So then once I sort of get it off, I can get a paper towel and dry it off also. Luckily, glaze comes off really easily as long as we just wash it off. So if that happens to you, not the end of the world, just sort of clean it off with a wet paintbrush. At this point, I'm ready for the next step. So I'm going to paint the eyes entirely with white, and then a little bit later, I'm going to go over it with the dark brown for my eye color. Now I also want to keep in mind that because this is a small space, I really want to make sure I have a nice, decent point on my paintbrush. And then I hold my paintbrush correctly. So my fingers are going to hold it down here at the top of the heel of the brush, this metallic part. And I'm going to make sure to hold my paintbrush straight up and down so that I'm getting really nice, even strokes. And what you might notice too is that my paintbrush just barely touches the surface here. Now, because I'm painting a small area, I also want to make sure that I have a nice pointed brush, a nice tip of my paintbrush is pointed, and then I also hold the paintbrush correctly. So I'm going to hold it down here at the top of this metallic part, the heel of the brush, and I'm going to barely touch the surface of the clay as I'm painting over it. So I never want to push my paintbrush down all the way because that does not give me nice detailed lines. So I'm going to dip it in here, and just the very tip of it should ever touch my clay so that I can make small little coats. Now, just like before, I want to be very careful that I'm not missing any spots. If I miss a spot, then it won't be shiny and it won't look like the rest. So I really make sure that I cover the whole thing, and you may have noticed also that as I'm painting, I'm even covering that iris part. That is okay because I'm going to be painting over it with a dark color anyway. So this is not going to affect the color of the iris if I'm painting this here. So now that I have the two coats, I can get ready for painting the eye on top. So I'm going to grab the brown that I'm going to use for the eyes. And once that's dry, I'm going to paint just the circular part in the middle of the eye. When I do that step, I have to be very careful that I don't get it on the white part of the eye. At this point, we really want to take our time and be precise about where we put that glaze. Okay, so I finished with the eyes, and then I just decided to paint the rest of the brown while the eyes were drying. If you notice, I actually made a mistake right here also. So if it's still wet, something we can do quickly is just use a tissue to sort of blot up the extra. And then just like before, we can use a wet paintbrush that is clean to just sort of wipe it away. The newer glaze should come off first. So I'm just going to clean it off like this and rub it until it sort of is better, it's gone. And then blot up the extra with my tissue. Once I can't see it anymore, then I might even want to wait for this to dry and do one more layer of that sort of tan color that I had here just to make sure it gets covered up. So if that happens to you and it's still wet, blot it with a tissue and then use a clean paintbrush to sort of scrub it off a little bit. Now at this point, most of my brown is dry, so I'm going to do another layer, again being very careful on the smaller features so that I don't get paint around it on the rest of the face. All right, then as I wait for this to dry, I'm going to paint the lips with a pinkish color. I already painted over the lips with the skin tone, and now I'm just going to paint over it with the pink. Okay, and then the last little detail I'm going to add is I'm going to use a little bit of black to try to get the pupils of these eyes here. So I would dip it in just a little bit and barely touch right where that hole is. You need steady hands for that. So I'm just going to stick it in there. And what you might notice is I'm taking my wrist and I'm just sort of resting it on the table or on my sculpture to just keep my hand steady. If I keep my hand in the air like this, then my hand might shake a little bit. So I really like to just put it down on something to keep it steady and very carefully sort of poke the middle where I created that pupil. And then I'm also going to paint a really thin line right on the bottom of the eyelid here, just to make it look like I have some kind of lash line. You can choose to do that step or skip it if you'd like to, but I just like the way that it looks, so very carefully, barely touching it. I'm going to paint right along the bottom of this eyelid. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side as well. So at this point, I'm just going to leave it to dry. I could check the back to make sure there's no glaze on the back so it doesn't stick to the kiln. If there is, like this, I can just take a wet sponge and sort of wash it off. And then it'll be placed in the kiln. When it comes out, you're going to see that the colors are much more vibrant and the entire thing is shiny.